The Vicar of Christ is refusing to clarify if he lifted the excommunication on Jesuit serial abuser. In an interview with the Associated Press, Pope Francis equivocated when repeatedly asked about his involvement in the case of the world-famous mosaic artist, Father Marko Ivan Rupnik, and his abuse of 20 nuns. The pontiff also failed to clarify if nuns abused by priests should be regarded as vulnerable adults. Francis said, "I think compensation was paid, but the arrangement is not clear to me there, but it was fixed." The reporter asked Francis, quote, "But in cases, did you have any role in the decision?" without clarifying if she was referring to the Pope's role in lifting Rupnik's excommunication. Francis replied in seemingly contradictory fashion, first saying nothing, and then saying, "I was involved in a small process that came to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the past."
Our reporter, who has now written over a dozen stories on the Rupnik scandal, Rome correspondent Dr. Jules Gomes, joins us from Rome. Jules, good to see you. Pope Francis had a golden opportunity to either come clean or clear the air about his involvement in the scandalous story, but he whiffed. It reminds me of the time when he whiffed on the question about Archbishop Carlo Vigano's original testimony back in 2018. Why, when it comes to Rupnik, though, did Francis not answer the questions?
Good evening, Hunter. If there were a Nobel Prize for papal waffle or papal fudge, Pope Francis would be the winner by miles. Now, he says about 9,000 words in Spanish. He's repeatedly asked by Nicole Winfield, the Associated Press reporter. She presses him 3 or 4 times on Rupnik specifically, but he continually prevaricates and talks about everything else under the sun, a lot to do with abuse, of course, but is very, very reluctant to answer specific questions on Rupnik. And when she presses him, it's like he's suffering from a monumental papal amnesia. I don't remember, I'm not sure, I think there may have been compensation paid to him. Now, we know Pope Francis micromanages things. We know Rupnik is a close friend and advisor to Pope Francis. This is the biggest scandal of the Francis pontificate, and yet he's pretending he doesn't know much. And question after question. Now, I must say the reporter was bold enough to ask these questions. Otherwise, most of the time, people who basically are Francis sycophants get to ask him questions, but she did not specifically ask him if he had anything to do with lifting the excommunication. Hunter.
Also, Jules, you said this is the biggest scandal in the Francis pontificate, which is really saying something considering this papacy, but the question still remains because he and the Vatican have refused to answer it. Did Francis lift the excommunication imposed on his friend, and if he didn't, who did?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, because we now have the protocol number of the excommunication, which was signed by Cardinal Luis Ladaria and Augustin Di Noia, the Assistant Secretary of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And in 1 month, that excommunication was lifted. Now, Ladaria would have to be pretty schizophrenic to U-turn within a month unless somebody from top put pressure on him. More importantly, a bigger question here is, when Francis knew that Rupnik had covered such grave crimes, why did he invite him to be the Lenten preacher to the Roman Curia after all this had happened? And more recently, when the media exploded with these scandals, why did the Vatican publish Rupnik's painting on the cover of their most recent stamp volume? The interview raises more questions than answers, Hunter, and that's very, very disappointing for Pope Francis.
Pretty consistent with his pontificate, and Pope Francis, he makes it difficult to be Catholic sometimes, but we can't stop praying for him because he seems to sure need our prayers. Dr. Gomes, thank you for your time.